The desert was silent. Only the wind carried the sound of sand moving across the ground. A human traveler named Daniel walked slowly, his boots sinking in the dust, his eyes searching the horizon for signs of life. He had been walking for hours, his throat dry, his bag almost empty, but then he saw something unusual. In the distance, smoke curled upward, dark and heavy. The smell of burned metal reached his nose even before he got close. Daniel stopped, his heart beating faster. Burned. Ships usually meant danger, bandits or worse, but curiosity and instinct pushed him forward, his legs moving faster through the sand. As he came closer, he saw the wreck. It was an alien ship, its silver hull broken in half, flames still flickering along the edges. The crash had torn the ground open, leaving black scars in the earth. Daniel raised his hand to shield his eyes from the smoke. Every step felt heavier as he neared the ship. He had seen many wrecks before, but something about this one felt different. There was a sound, faint but clear, cutting through the crackle of fire. It was not the sound of metal breaking, nor the groan of shifting wreckage. It was softer, weaker. A cry. Daniel froze, his hand tightening around the handle of his old blade. He listened carefully. The cry came again, high and trembling, the cry of a baby. His chest tightened. He hurried forward, climbing over twisted metal, his boots crunching on glass-like fragments. Inside the wreck, the air was thick with smoke, but he pressed on, his eyes searching in the shadows. At last, he saw them. A woman sat against the wall, her arms wrapped tightly around a small bundle, her skin pale blue and marked with ash. She was an alien, her hair long and tangled, silver strands falling across her face, her body trembling from exhaustion. The bundle in her arms moved, and a tiny cry escaped from it, the alien baby's. Voice weak but alive, Daniel's breath caught. He had expected to find scavengers or corpses, not this. The woman looked up at him with wide, fearful eyes, her lips moving but no words coming out. Her face was filled with both relief and terror. She pulled the baby closer, as if protecting it from him. For a long moment, neither spoke. Only the crackle of fire and the baby's small cries filled the silence. Daniel knelt slowly, keeping his hands open to show he meant no harm. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said softly, though he was not sure if she understood his words. Her gaze stayed locked on him, her breathing fast and shallow. The baby whimpered again, its tiny fist pressing against the cloth it was wrapped in. Daniel's heart ached. Memories of his past flickered in his mind, a time when he had lost someone dear. The sound of the baby's cry felt like a knife cutting into those old wounds. He could not walk away. Not now. Not with them like this. Still, he hesitated. Helping them meant danger. It meant trouble from others who hated aliens. The ship groaned. A piece of burning metal fell with a loud crash, sparks flying across the floor. The alien woman flinched, shielding her child with her body. Her face pressed against the baby's head. Daniel acted quickly, moving closer, pulling the heavy metal aside before it could block the only path out. The heat pressed against his skin, sweat dripping from his forehead. "You can't stay here," he muttered, coughing through the smoke. The woman looked at him, tears cutting lines through the ash on her face, her lips trembling as she whispered something in her own language. Daniel did not understand, but he could see the meaning in her eyes. She was begging for help. He nodded. Once firmly his decision made, he reached out his hand. Slowly, carefully. The woman hesitated, clutching her baby tighter, her body shaking. But when another explosion echoed through the wreck, the fire spreading faster, she finally placed her hand in his. Her fingers were cold, weak, but desperate. Daniel pulled her up, supporting her as she leaned against him, her legs almost too weak to walk. He guided them through the broken passages, every step a fight against smoke and falling debris. The baby's cries grew softer, more tired, and Daniel's heart pounded with fear that the child might stop breathing. "Hold on," he whispered, his voice rough. "Just hold on." Finally, they stumbled out into the open air, the harsh desert wind hitting their faces. Behind them, the ship collapsed, fire roaring as the last of it gave way. The woman nearly fell, but Daniel held her steady, his arm strong around her. She looked at him with eyes full of exhaustion and sorrow. Yet in that look, there was also a fragile hope. Daniel glanced at the baby so small and helpless in her arms, its skin faintly glowing under the fading sun. He had found more than survivors. He had found a choice, a burden, and maybe a reason to keep going. The desert stretched endless before them, filled with danger and uncertainty. But as Daniel looked at the woman and her child, he knew one thing. Clearly, he could not abandon them. The burned ship was gone, the past turned into ashes. Now only the future remained, and it began with this widow and her baby in his care. Daniel stood in the dust with the alien widow leaning on his arm, and the baby crying softly against her chest. The burned ship still glowed behind them. Smoke, rising like a warning into the sky. Every instinct told him to walk away, to leave before others arrived, scavengers, soldiers, or worse. Helping them would bring trouble, and he knew it. He looked at the woman, her skin covered in ash, her eyes wide and shining with fear. She was too weak to stand without him, too tired to even take a step. The baby stirred, letting out a faint whimper, its small fingers curling around the cloth it was wrapped in. Daniel felt the sound go deep into his chest, shaking something he had long buried. He thought of his past, of a small house on earth that had once been filled with laughter, a family that was gone now, stolen by war, leaving him nothing but silence and dust. The widow's face reminded him of his own sorrow, the same hollow pain of losing everything. If he left them here, they would not survive the night. The desert would claim them quickly. But if he chose to stay with them, he would not only fight the desert, he would fight the world. Humans distrusted aliens, feared them, hated them. Villages would turn them away. Bandits would hunt them, and soldiers would punish anyone who offered shelter. Daniel clenched his jaw, his eyes shifting between the widow, the baby, and the dark horizon. The woman whispered something in her language, her voice trembling like a candle in the wind. He could not understand the words, but the meaning was clear. She was pleading, begging him not to leave them. Her grip on the child tightened, her body shaking with exhaustion, yet her spirit clung fiercely to hope. Daniel's throat felt dry, not from the desert, but from the weight of the choice pressing down on him. He sighed heavily, then knelt in the sand so he could look at her at eye level. "I don't know your name," he said softly, his voice rough, "but I know you don't deserve to die out here." Her eyes filled with tears glistening against the ash on her cheeks. The baby let out a weak cry. Almost as if agreeing with him, Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, then opened them with a hard resolve. "I'll help you," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "I won't leave you." The woman's lips trembled. She did not understand his words, but she understood his actions. When he gently adjusted the cloth around her baby, she let out a sob of relief. He shifted his pack, slung it tighter on his shoulders, and pulled her closer to him for support. Her legs barely moved, but with his strength, she managed a step, then another. They walked slowly, leaving the wreck behind, every step pulling them farther into the unknown. Daniel glanced back once at the burning ship, knowing that by saving them he had changed his path forever. The desert stretched before them, wide and merciless. The sun was low, but its heat still pressed against their skin. Daniel's throat burned from thirst, yet he shared the last drops of water from his flask with the woman. She tried to refuse, shaking her head weakly, but he pressed the bottle gently against her lips until she drank. The baby coughed softly, its voice fragile. Daniel's heart clenched at the sound. He leaned closer, whispering words the child could not understand. "You'll make it, little one. Just hold on." The woman watched him with tired eyes, confusion and gratitude mixing in her gaze. For the first time, she seemed to believe he was not her enemy. But as the sky darkened, Daniel's unease grew. He knew they were not alone. Smoke from the crash would draw attention, and not the good kind. Scavengers always came to wrecks, hunting for scrap, weapons, or captives. And if they found him carrying an alien woman and her baby, they would not let him walk away. A faint noise reached his ears, the crunch of sand under boots far behind them. Daniel stiffened, his hand reaching instinctively for the hilt of his blade. The widow noticed his sudden tension and pulled her child closer, her breathing quickening. Shadows moved in the distance, shapes against the setting sun, slow and deliberate. Damn. Daniel muttered under his breath, his mind racing. He knew what they wanted, not the wreck, not the scrap, but the survivors. An alien widow and her baby were worth more than any piece of metal, slaves, bargaining chips, or worse. His grip tightened on the blade, anger boiling inside him. The woman whispered again, fear trembling in her voice. Daniel looked at her, then at the baby, then at the approaching figures. This was no longer about whether he should help. It was about whether he could protect them. He felt the weight of his choice sink deeper, heavier, and yet there was no turning back now. He bent low, speaking in a calm voice, though his chest burned with tension. "Stay close, don't let go," he said firmly, even if she did not understand the words. Her eyes locked on his, and for a brief moment, trust flickered between them. Fragile but real, Daniel straightened, his stance firm, his blade ready, his heart set. The scavengers were closing in, but Daniel stood his ground. He had made his choice. He would fight for the widow and her baby, no matter the cost. The desert wind howled, carrying the scent of fire and danger. The night had come, and with it, his battle to protect the family he never expected to find. The desert night wrapped itself around them like a cold blanket. Daniel kept his arm strong around the alien widow as they moved slowly across the dunes. The baby's soft cries echoed in the silence, small but dangerous, because every sound in the wasteland could draw hunters. The smoke from the wreck had faded, but Daniel knew the scavengers were still behind them, following like wolves waiting for weakness. The woman stumbled often, her body weak, but she refused to let go of her child. Her silver hair glowed faintly in the moonlight, tangled and heavy with ash. Daniel glanced at her face and saw both exhaustion and determination, a strange strength born from love. He respected it, though it made his burden heavier. The desert stretched endless before them, dunes rising like dark waves. Daniel's boots sank deep into the sand, each step a battle against fatigue. His pack felt heavier than ever, though it carried little more than rope, a few tools, and scraps of dried food. But now he carried more than supplies. He carried 2 lives in his hands. The wind cut across his face, sharp and cold. He adjusted his coat and pulled it tighter around the widow, sheltering her and the baby from the chill. She looked at him with wide eyes, whispering a soft word in her language, her voice almost a breath Daniel didn't understand, but he nodded, knowing she was thanking him. As the hours dragged on, the baby cried again, louder this time. Daniel froze, scanning the horizon, his hand gripping the hilt of his blade. The sound carried, far, bouncing across the sand and stones. He could almost feel eyes in the darkness, waiting, listening. "Shh," he whispered gently, his voice steady though his heart raced. He knelt and adjusted the cloth around the baby, rocking it slightly, awkward but careful. The widow watched him with surprise, her lips parting, her fear softening just a little. The child quieted. Small, hiccups fading into silence, they walked again, step after step, the night endless. Daniel thought about shelter, about where to take them, about how to keep them alive. The nearest settlement was far too far for their weak bodies. He remembered an old cave he had once used, hidden in the cliffs a few miles east. The thought of reaching it gave him a goal, a small hope. "Just a little farther," he muttered, though he spoke more to himself than to them. The widow looked at him, tilting her head as if trying to read his tone. Maybe she could not understand his words, but she understood his will to keep going. But the desert was cruel, and the danger never rested. Near midnight he heard it, footsteps crunching faintly in the sand behind them. Daniel's blood went cold. He turned slightly, his eyes catching movement in the distance. Figures, shadowy and low, moving carefully but closing in. He swore under his breath, his mind racing. If they reached the cave, he could defend the entrance, but out here, in the open, they were easy prey. He pushed forward, urging the woman to move faster. Though her legs trembled with each step, the baby stirred again and Daniel's chest tightened with dread. The scavengers were clever. They did not rush. They circled, keeping distance. He could almost feel their hunger for profit, their eyes locked on. The widow and child. They whispered to one another, voices carried faintly on the wind. Daniel tightened his grip on his blade, his body tense, ready for a fight. But he also knew fighting now would be suicide. He had to outlast them, survive until shelter. So he kept moving, each step deliberate, each glance over his shoulder sharper. His breath came in short bursts, not from fear, but from the weight of responsibility pressing against him. At last, just as the moon reached its highest point, Daniel spotted the dark outline of cliffs in the distance. Relief washed over him, but only for a moment. Because the scavengers had noticed too, they began to close in faster, realizing their chance was slipping away. Daniel gritted his teeth, sweat chilling on his skin despite the cold night air. Almost there, he whispered again, his voice rough. The widow stumbled, nearly falling. Daniel caught her, pulling her close against his side. Her breath was ragged, her body near collapse, but she did not release her baby, not even for a heartbeat. That stubborn strength gave Daniel the fire to push harder. The scavengers were closer now, their shapes clearer, their voices louder. He heard laughter, cruel and sharp, a sound that made the widow flinch. Daniel felt fury rise in his chest, not just anger at them, but anger at the world that left a woman and child to be hunted like prey. His steps grew harder, faster, the cliffs drawing nearer with every heartbeat. Finally, they reached the base, the rock face towering above them like a wall. Daniel knew the cave entrance was hidden higher. Behind a ridge, he guided the widow carefully, climbing slowly, his muscles burning. The baby stirred again, but this time did not cry, as if sensing the danger and holding its tiny silence. Behind them, the scavengers shouted, closing in fast. Daniel pulled them higher, his boots scraping against the stone, his hands raw from gripping rough edges. Every breath felt like fire in his chest, but he refused to stop. At last, he spotted the narrow crack in the rock that led into the hidden cave. He pushed the widow through first, guiding her inside with the baby. Then he slid in after, turning quickly to face the darkness outside. The scavengers reached the base of the cliff, their torches glowing like angry eyes in the night. Daniel crouched at the entrance, his blade in hand, his body ready. The long walk had brought them here. But it was not the end. The desert had tested them, the scavengers had followed, and the night still held danger. But inside this cave, with stone at his back and the widow and baby behind him, Daniel knew one thing. He was ready to fight as long as it took to keep them alive. The cave was dark, the air cold and still. Daniel leaned against the stone, his blade gripped tightly in his hand, his ears straining to catch every sound outside. The widow sat deeper inside, cradling her baby close, her silver hair faintly glowing in the dim moonlight that seeped through the crack in the wall. Her eyes were wide, watching Daniel with fear and trust mixed together. Outside, the scavengers' voices echoed faintly, laughter and whispers bouncing across the cliff. Their torches flickered against the rocks, moving like restless spirits in the night. Daniel's jaw clenched, his mind racing. He knew they would not give up easily. Scavengers never did, especially when prey was this valuable. The widow whispered something, her voice trembling. Daniel glanced back. Her alien words meant little to him, but her eyes said enough. She was asking if they were safe, begging for reassurance. He forced a small nod, though his heart was heavy. He would keep them safe or die trying. Hours crawled by slowly, the desert night stretching endless. Every now and then, the scavengers tested the cliffs, their voices drifting closer, then fading again. Daniel stayed awake, his blade across his knees, his back stiff against the wall. He could not afford sleep, not with shadows lurking just beyond the stone. The baby stirred, letting out a soft whimper. The widow rocked it gently, humming a strange tune in her language, her voice low and soothing. The sound filled the cave, fragile but warm. For a moment, Daniel felt the harshness of the night soften, replaced by a thin thread of peace. But peace never lasted long in the wastelands. A stone clattered outside, a sound too sharp, too close. Daniel tensed instantly. Crouching near the entrance, his blade ready, shadows moved beyond the crack, faint outlines against the moonlight. The scavengers had found the path. They were climbing the rocks. Daniel's pulse thundered in his ears, his breath steady but fierce. He leaned close to the widow, whispering sharply, "Stay back. Don't move." She nodded quickly, clutching her baby tight, pulling herself deeper into the cave. The first scavenger appeared at the entrance, his face half hidden under a hood, eyes glinting with greed. He grinned when he saw Daniel, lifting a rusted weapon. But before he could speak, Daniel lunged forward, his blade flashing in the moonlight. The strike was quick and silent. The man dropped without a sound. Another shadow moved in, faster, more cautious. Daniel blocked the entrance with his body, slashing with precision, the clash of metal sharp. In the silence, the widow gasped softly, holding her baby tighter, her body trembling as she watched the human fight for them. Daniel's arms burned, but he did not retreat, every strike driven by pure will. The scavenger hissed and fell back, clutching a wound. Outside, more voices rose, angry now, their patience broken. Torches flared brighter, shadows stretched longer. Daniel's heart pounded. He knew they would come all at once. He turned to the widow, his voice low but fierce. "No matter what you hear, keep quiet. Hold the baby, don't come out." Her eyes filled with tears. She nodded quickly, her lips trembling as she whispered something soft. He didn't understand the words, but he knew the meaning. It was a prayer, or maybe a goodbye. The next wave came fast. 3 men scrambling into the crack, weapons ready. Daniel roared, his blade slashing, sparks flying as steel clashed against steel. The cave echoed with grunts, the scrape of stone, the hiss of blades. Daniel fought. Like a cornered wolf, every strike meant to kill, every step meant to protect. One scavenger fell, another pressed harder, their weapon cutting across Daniel's arm, blood dripping onto the stone. Pain burned hot, but he ignored it, slamming his blade forward, forcing the man back. The third tried to slip past him into the cave, but Daniel blocked him, fury in his eyes. "No," he growled, his voice like thunder in the dark. The widow cried out softly, but held her ground, shielding the baby with her body. Daniel struck again, his blade cutting through the last scavenger's defense. The man crumpled, his torch rolling into the cave, casting wild shadows across the walls. For a heartbeat, silence returned, heavy and sharp. Daniel staggered, breathing hard, his arm bleeding, his muscles trembling with exhaustion. But outside he heard more voices, more footsteps. The scavengers were not finished. He leaned against the wall, sweat dripping down his face, his mind racing. They would not stop until either he fell or they gave up hope. The widow crawled closer, her eyes wide with fear, her hand reaching toward his wound. Daniel shook his head quickly, pushing her back gently. "Stay with the child," he whispered. "Don't waste your strength on me." Her tears fell, but she obeyed, pulling the baby close again. Daniel tightened his grip on the blade, forcing his weary body to stand straight. The night outside was alive with shadows, torches flickering, like hungry eyes. He knew the battle was not over, not yet. But as he stood there, bleeding, exhausted, his eyes burning with defiance, one truth filled his heart. He was not fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for the widow and her baby, for the fragile hope he had found among ashes. The shadows in the night would come again, but so would his blade, and until his last breath, he would not let them pass. The night finally passed, and dawn spread pale light over the desert cliffs. Daniel sat at the cave's entrance, his blade across his lap, his arm bandaged with torn cloth. The widow and her baby rested deeper inside, their breathing soft and steady. For the first time, since the wreck, silence felt safe, but Daniel knew it would not last. He scanned the horizon as the sun climbed higher. The scavengers had left before dawn, their torches disappearing into the night. But their tracks remained in the sand. Proof they would return if they thought the survivors were worth chasing. Daniel tightened his grip on his blade, then sighed. The fight was only paused, not over. The widow stirred, her silver hair tangled, her face pale but calmer than before. She rocked her baby gently, whispering soft words in her language. When she looked at Daniel, her eyes showed exhaustion, gratitude, and a question. What next? Daniel pointed toward the east, his voice steady. There's a village not far, we can find shelter there. The walk was slow, every step heavy with fatigue. Daniel guided them carefully down from the cliffs, the widow leaning on him, the baby held close to her chest. The desert stretched wide once more, but this time Daniel had a direction. He knew the hidden village, small and poor, tucked between hills where trade rarely reached. By midday, the outlines appeared, wooden fences broken in places, smoke rising. From simple homes, the widow's eyes widened, hope flickering across her face, but Daniel's stomach tightened. He knew the people here. He knew their fear of outsiders, especially aliens. Still, there was no choice. Without food, water, and shelter, they would not survive. As they approached, villagers stopped their work and stared. Men with tools paused mid-swing. Women carrying baskets froze. Children peeked. From behind doors, their eyes first went to Daniel, then to the alien woman beside him, and finally to the baby in her arms. Whispers spread quickly, sharp and distrustful. One man stepped forward, his face lined with age and suspicion. Daniel, he said harshly, what is this you've brought to our doors? Daniel straightened, his voice firm, though his body ached. They need help, food, water, a place to rest. The man's eyes narrowed. They are not human. The crowd murmured in agreement, voices rising. Aliens bring trouble, one woman muttered. Bad luck follows them. They'll draw soldiers, another hissed, and we'll all pay the price. Daniel felt the widow shrink closer to him, her hand clutching his sleeve tightly. The baby whimpered, and the sound seemed to pierce the crowd. Some faces softened for a moment, but fear quickly returned. Daniel took a slow breath, stepping forward, his presence strong. I fought for them last night, he said, his voice heavy. Scavengers would have taken them. They would be dead if I had walked away. The villagers hesitated, glancing at one another, but suspicion still burned in their eyes. Daniel clenched his fist, frustration boiling. These people had once welcomed him, trusted him. Now they stood ready to cast out a mother and child because of fear. He turned to face them fully, his voice loud and clear. You all know me, he declared, his eyes sweeping the crowd. I have lived among you, I have bled with you, I have stood guard for your homes. Murmurs ran through the group, some nodding reluctantly. And now I tell you this, Daniel continued, pointing to the widow and her baby. They are under my protection. Gasps rippled through the villagers. The elder stepped forward, again his voice sharp. Daniel, you would risk all of us for them. Daniel's gaze was hard, unflinching. I would risk myself, not you. But if danger comes, I'll stand in front of it before it reaches your doors. The widow looked at him in shock, her lips trembling, her eyes filling with tears. She didn't understand the words, but she felt the meaning. The baby cried louder, its small fists waving. Daniel gently touched the cloth around it, his rough hands surprisingly careful. This child has done nothing wrong, he said firmly. This woman has lost everything. Will you really turn your backs when we could give them a chance to live? The crowd wavered, whispers softening, doubt mixing with fear. At last, an old woman in the back spoke, her voice cracked but steady. We cannot turn away a mother and child no matter their skin. The elder scowled, but he could not ignore her. One by one, villagers lowered their eyes, their anger fading into uneasy silence. Daniel nodded slowly, relief in his chest, though tension still lingered in the air. He guided the widow through the gates into the heart of the village. Children stared wide-eyed, some curious, some afraid. The widow clutched her baby tightly, her eyes darting. But she stayed close to Daniel, trusting his presence. That night, they were given a small hut at the edge of the settlement. It was worn and dusty, but it had a roof and walls, and that was enough. Daniel set down his pack, helping the widow sit, her body weak. The baby nursed softly, its cries finally calming into silence. Daniel sat in the corner, his blade leaning nearby. He listened to the quiet sounds of the baby breathing, the widow humming her soft lullaby. For the first time since he had found them, they were not running, not hiding, not fighting, but he knew peace would not last. Whispers had already spread through the village and suspicion burned like hidden fire. Daniel leaned his head back against the wall, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. He had brought them to shelter, but the real battle was just beginning, because the village was not only a place of safety, it was a place of judgment, and soon he would have to prove that this widow and her baby deserved to stay. The hut at the edge of the village was quiet, but outside the silence was heavy with judgment. Daniel could feel the stares every time he stepped out, villagers pausing in their work to glance at the alien widow and her baby. Children whispered. Adults muttered, and fear clung to the air like smoke. He ignored it as best as he could, but he knew the tension was rising. Inside the hut, the widow moved carefully, tending to her baby. She had grown stronger since leaving the wreck, though her body still bore the marks of exhaustion. Her silver hair, once tangled and full of ash, now shimmered faintly when the light touched it. Daniel often caught himself staring, not with fear like the villagers, but with something closer to respect. The baby was healthier too, its cries louder, its small fists stronger. Daniel had even managed to draw a laugh from the child once, a sound so pure it startled him. The widow had smiled for the first time then, a smile that carried warmth despite her sorrow. That moment reminded Daniel why he had chosen this path. Even as the village turned colder toward him, whispers grew, louder each day. Why keep them here, some said. They'll bring soldiers. They are cursed, others muttered. Bad luck follows aliens. The elder called a meeting, and Daniel knew it would decide everything. That night the villagers gathered near the central fire, their faces lit by flickering flames. The widow sat close to Daniel, holding her baby tightly, her eyes darting nervously at the hostile stares. Daniel stood tall, his blade strapped at his side, his voice steady though his heart pounded. She and her child deserve to live, he declared, his words cutting through the murmurs. The elder frowned, his voice sharp. They are not one of us, Daniel. You risk too much by bringing them here. If soldiers find out, they will punish us all. The crowd muttered in agreement, nodding with fear in their eyes. Daniel's jaw tightened, his gaze sweeping across them. You talk of risk, but what about honor? What about humanity? Do we only help those who look like us? The villagers fell quiet, shifting uneasily. The widow looked up at him, her eyes wide, though she did not understand his words. Her baby stirred and began to cry, the sound breaking through. The tense silence, Daniel reached out, gently touching the cloth around the child, his voice lowering. This baby has no weapon, no curse, only life. Are you truly afraid of life? The crowd shifted again, whispers breaking out, some ashamed, others still doubtful. The elder shook his head. Words do not change blood. Daniel, they will never belong. Daniel's eyes burned, his voice rising. Then I will make them belong. If blood and skin divide us, then I will give them my name. Gasps erupted from the crowd, the villagers staring at him in shock. Even the widow's eyes widened, her lips parting in disbelief. Daniel turned to her, kneeling slowly, his hand resting gently over her arm. You are my family now, he said softly, his voice trembling but firm. She did not understand the words, but when he pressed his hand over his chest, then touched hers, she knew. Her eyes filled with tears, her body trembling, but for the first time, she did not look. Afraid, the villagers erupted into arguments, voices rising around the fire. He's lost his mind, one shouted, giving his name to an alien. Blasphemy, another cried. He dishonors his people. But others stayed silent, their expressions softer, thoughtful, moved by Daniel's defiance. The elder's face darkened. You would break tradition, Daniel, you would shame us all. Daniel stepped closer, his shadow stretching tall in the firelight. Tradition means nothing if it makes us blind. I will not walk away from them, not now, not ever. His voice carried strength, The same strength that had faced scavengers in the night, the same strength that had pulled the widow from the wreck. The villagers felt it, and though many still resisted, doubt had taken root. The widow reached for Daniel's hand, holding it with her trembling fingers. The baby rested against her chest, its soft glow reflecting the firelight. Daniel stood beside her, his presence unshakable, his declaration unbroken. Whatever the cost, they were his family now. The elder, seeing the crowd waver, shook his head bitterly. If danger comes, it will be on you, Daniel. Their blood will be your burden. Daniel met his gaze without flinching. Then let it be mine. The widow looked up at him with tear-filled eyes, whispering something in her language, a word soft and full of meaning. Though he did not understand it, Daniel felt the weight of gratitude and trust within it. That night, in the hut, silence lingered between them. The widow sat close, her baby asleep in her arms. Her eyes still, shimmering from tears, Daniel leaned back against the wall, his mind heavy, his body aching, but his heart strangely at peace. He had given them his name, and with it, his promise. Outside, the village still whispered, still doubted, but inside the hut, something had changed. The widow no longer looked at him as just a rescuer, but as something more. And Daniel, for the first time in years, no longer felt alone. He had chosen them, and in that choice he had found a family. Morning came quietly over the village. The sun painted the sky in soft shades of gold, and the desert stretched wide and endless. Daniel stepped outside the small hut, his blade hanging at his side, his eyes scanning the horizon. For the first time in many days, no smoke rose, no shadows followed, no danger approached. Behind him he heard the widow humming softly, her baby nestled against her chest. Her voice was fragile yet steady, like a melody carried from another world. Daniel turned and saw her smiling faintly at the child, her silver hair glowing in the sunlight that slipped through the cracks. It was a smile of hope, something he had not seen since the day he found her in the wreck. The village was waking too, smoke rising from fires, children running between houses, adults gathering to begin their work. Yet their eyes still turned toward the hut at the edge, whispers still followed. Some carried suspicion, others carried curiosity, but slowly, a change was stirring. The people could not ignore the sight of Daniel standing with the widow and child as if they were his own. One day, a young girl from the village brought a small basket of fruit. She placed it shyly near the door before running back, her laughter echoing in the morning air. The widow picked up the basket with wide eyes, holding it as if it were treasure. Daniel smiled faintly, knowing that kindness had begun to grow, even if only in small steps. The baby laughed more often, now its voice light and bright. Sometimes Daniel would make silly faces, awkward and rough, but enough to draw giggles. The sound always made the widow cover her mouth with her hand, hiding her smile. Each laugh was like a spark, warming the cold edges of the village and of Daniel's own heart. But peace was never without weight. At night, Daniel sat by the fire, sharpening his blade, his mind uneasy. He knew soldiers roamed these lands, and if they learned that the village sheltered aliens, trouble would fall. Still, he refused to let fear rule. He had chosen this path, and he would see it through. The villagers watched him closely, some waiting for him to fail, others quietly admiring his defiance. One evening, the elder approached, his face heavy with years and doubt. "You have changed this place, Daniel," he said, his voice quiet but sharp. "Whether for better or worse, only time will tell." Daniel met his gaze calmly, replying, "I did only what was right. Nothing more." The elder studied him for a long moment, then turned away. Daniel knew he had not won the man's heart, but perhaps he had planted a seed. The real change was not in words, but in the sight of a mother and child living safely under human care. That sight spoke louder than any argument could. As days turned into weeks, the widow grew stronger. She walked through the village now, her steps still cautious but no longer trembling. Some villagers greeted her with small nods. Some children followed curiously. The baby, wrapped in soft cloth, reached out tiny hands toward them, disarming. Even the harshest stares, Daniel often walked beside them, his tall frame a shield, his presence steady. He felt something he had not felt in years, belonging. Not just in the village, but in this fragile family he had built from ashes. Every choice, every wound, every sleepless night had led him to this, and he did not regret it. One dawn, as the sun rose over the desert, Daniel stood with the widow at the edge of the village. The horizon glowed with light, the air cool and calm. The widow looked at him, her eyes reflecting the gold of morning, and whispered something in her language. He did not know the words, but her tone was gentle, filled with gratitude, and perhaps something deeper. Daniel nodded, placing a hand over his chest, then over hers. "You're not alone anymore," he said softly, his voice steady. The baby cooed, reaching a small hand toward him, and Daniel let the tiny fingers wrap around his calloused own. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like a promise of tomorrow. The village bell rang, calling people to work, life moving forward, for the first time in many years. Daniel did not feel like a wanderer or an outsider. He felt like a protector, a father, a man who had chosen not just survival but family. The burned ship and the smoke were memories now, replaced by the warmth of a new dawn. The widow and her baby stood beside him, their presence no longer a burden but a gift. The villagers, slowly and uncertainly, began to see it too. And though the future was uncertain, Daniel knew one truth. With absolute clarity, family was not only blood, it was choice, and in this choice, he had found his own salvation. As the sun rose higher, painting the desert in light, Daniel smiled faintly. The long road of sorrow had ended here, replaced by something new. Together, they would face whatever came next. Not as strangers, not as outcasts, but as a family. A new dawn had come, and with it hope for tomorrow,